The question that changed everything. Have you ever watched someone carry peace like it was made of glass, fragile yet unbreakable? Have you ever seen two people so careful with each other's hearts that silence became their language? This is the story of how one question about marriage reopened an old door between Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, a door that fame, time, and pain had quietly closed years ago. Keanu Reeves had always lived between worlds, the one the world celebrated and the one only he could see. His mornings began with quiet coffee. His nights ended with the hum of old vinyl records, and in between were moments of calm that most people mistook for loneliness. He never corrected them. Because to him, peace was not absence of people. It was the presence of understanding. But on a bright spring morning, when a journalist asked him the one question he had avoided for years, "Have you ever thought of marriage again?" Something inside him shifted. The cameras flashed, the room waited, and for a brief second, he looked lost in time. His fingers tightened around the armrest. His breath caught like he had been pulled into a memory. Everyone thought he would give a polite answer and move on. But instead, he smiled. That quiet, distant smile that always seemed to hold a story. "Marriage," he said slowly, "is not about timing. It's about truth. And truth doesn't always come when you expect it." The audience clapped lightly, thinking it was just another thoughtful line from Keanu. But those who knew him well could see something deeper behind his eyes. A story untold. A name unspoken. Later that evening, as the interview clip spread across social media, people began connecting dots they had carried for years. The internet revived old interviews, photos, movie clips, and behind-the-scenes moments. One pattern appeared again and again: Sandra Bullock. They remembered her soft laughter beside him on talk shows, the way they finished each other's sentences, the way she once said, "He's someone you just can't stop caring about." And now, years later, his words about truth and timing felt like a hidden message, a whisper meant for her. Across the city, Sandra Bullock sat alone in her kitchen, the same clip playing on her phone screen. The video had already gone viral, but she wasn't watching it like the world did. She wasn't looking for clues or confessions. She was looking for something familiar in his tone. That quiet honesty that used to calm her when everything else felt uncertain. When the reporter asked about marriage, she noticed the slight pause before he answered. She had seen that pause before, long ago, in moments when he was afraid his truth might hurt someone. She replayed the line again. "Marriage is not about timing, it's about truth." And for the first time in years, she whispered his name under her breath, as if saying it could bring him closer. Keanu. Their friendship had always been something the world misunderstood. It was never loud, never public, but deeply real. They had met on the set of a movie where they learned to trust each other without trying. Between takes, they shared stories about loneliness, about loss, about finding purpose in silence. Over time, their bond grew, not from romance, but from mutual respect. He once told her, "You make chaos look kind." And she replied, "And you make sadness look peaceful." It wasn't love in the ordinary sense. It was something purer, something that didn't need to be named. But the years had pulled them apart. Careers, heartbreaks, distance, all the quiet thieves that steal what words cannot protect. They stayed in touch sometimes, short calls, short messages, and yet the space between them grew heavy with unspoken things. Now, after hearing that interview, something inside Sandra began to stir. She couldn't explain it, but the truth he mentioned felt incomplete, like it was still waiting to be said. Maybe to her. The next day, her assistant mentioned that a major award event was coming up. Keanu was scheduled to attend, and so was she. For a moment, Sandra hesitated. She had avoided such events for months, preferring her private peace over red carpets. But that night, as she scrolled through the endless reactions online, comments filled with nostalgia, old movie scenes, and people writing they were meant to be, she felt something strange. Not pressure, not curiosity, but a quiet pull, the kind that comes when the past calls softly, not asking for answers, but closure. Meanwhile, Keanu sat by his window in his Los Angeles home, reading a letter he had written years ago but never sent. The paper was creased, the ink slightly faded. It was a letter to Sandra, written after a night when he almost told her how he felt, but chose silence instead. In the letter, he had written, "Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stay their friend, even when your heart wants more." He folded the paper back into the envelope and placed it beside an old photograph from the movie set where they first met. She was laughing in that picture, holding a cup of coffee, unaware that he was looking at her like she was the only calm thing in a noisy world. As the days passed, the online buzz grew stronger. Interviews replayed, fans speculated, and even talk shows revived old memories. The story had become a symbol of respect, of what it means to care for someone without needing to own them. Yet beneath all the noise, the two people at the center of it remained silent, until one afternoon Keanu's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. The name that appeared froze him for a moment. Sandra B. He let the phone ring once, twice, then answered softly, "Hey." Her voice came through gently, almost hesitant. "I saw your interview." He smiled faintly. "I figured you would." "You talked about truth," she said. "Do you still believe in it?" He paused, then replied, "Only when it leads to peace." There was silence between them, the kind that carried 1,000 unsaid memories. That brief call lasted less than 5 minutes, but it changed everything. For the first time in years, their walls cracked, not because of nostalgia, but because truth had finally touched the edges of something unfinished. Neither of them spoke about meeting, but they both felt it was coming. Not because the world wanted it, but because some stories are written to find their own ending, no matter how long it takes. That night, as Sandra turned off the lights and looked out her window, she saw the faint city glow reflecting on her glass. She whispered quietly, "Truth and timing," and wondered which one had finally found them first. What she didn't know was that Keanu had already made a decision. He looked at the envelope again, the letter he had kept hidden for years, and whispered, "It's time." The next morning, he placed the letter in his coat pocket, stepped outside into the bright lost sun, and walked toward a destination that would soon change not just his life, but hers too. And as the camera of fate began to roll once more, the world had no idea that behind every viral headline, there was a story of two people learning that sometimes the truest kind of love is the one that waits in silence until the right moment finally arrives. The letter and the spotlight, the morning felt heavier than usual, though the sky was clear. Keanu Reeves drove through Los Angeles traffic with the quiet hum of an old car engine beneath him, the kind of sound that reminded him of the early days, before fame, before headlines, before silence became his language. The letter sat in the inside pocket of his coat, pressing lightly against his chest with every heartbeat. It was a simple envelope, aged but unforgotten, carrying the words he never dared to speak. He didn't know if he was going to give it to her, but he knew he had to carry it. His destination wasn't planned with logic, only feeling. The award ceremony that evening was meant to be another polished gathering of faces, smiles, and lights. He usually attended quietly, stood for photos, gave a few words, and disappeared. But this time, something different pulled him there. Not the cameras, not the celebration, but the possibility of seeing her again after so many years. The drive was long, the air inside the car filled with that gentle mix of nostalgia and fear. He thought about the first time they met on set, how she laughed when he accidentally spilled coffee on the script, and how he spent the next hour helping her dry the pages under a hairdryer. He remembered her telling him, "You don't need to fix every mistake. Sometimes it's just part of the story." He smiled at that memory now, realizing she had been unknowingly talking about their lives. By late afternoon, Sandra Bullock was sitting in her dressing room surrounded by stylists and assistants. The makeup lights reflected off the mirror, but her thoughts were far from the noise around her. She kept her eyes fixed on the small silver bracelet on her wrist, a gift Keanu had given her decades ago during the filming of their first movie together. It wasn't expensive, just simple silver engraved with a single word: patience. She wore it rarely, but tonight she had taken it out of a small wooden box she kept hidden in her drawer. No one around her knew what it meant. To them, it was just an accessory. But to her, it was a reminder of calm, of kindness, and of a bond that had survived in silence longer than most friendships survive in words. Her assistant spoke softly. "They said Keanu will be there tonight." Sandra nodded, keeping her expression steady. "I know. You look nervous," the assistant added. "No," Sandra replied with a small smile. "I'm just remembering." As the evening arrived, cameras lined up along the red carpet. Flashes burst like white lightning against dark velvet curtains. Keanu arrived quietly, as he always did, in a simple black suit, his long hair tied loosely, his face calm but distant. He walked past the crowd, waving gently, his eyes searching not for attention, but for something familiar. He entered the hall, the sound of applause echoing faintly. Moments later, Sandra arrived. The crowd's reaction was instant. Cheers, excitement, the familiar chant of her name. But when she stepped into the hall and their eyes finally met across the glowing space, everything else blurred. For a few seconds, neither moved. It was as if time paused, letting memory and truth breathe again. The soft hum of background music filled the silence between them, and the lights reflected in their eyes like fragments of a shared past. They didn't rush toward each other. Instead, they both smiled. That small, knowing smile that two people share when words are too fragile to use. As the night went on, they found themselves sitting at nearby tables. During the first award break, Sandra stood and quietly walked toward him. The audience's attention was elsewhere, so her approach was unnoticed by most. Keanu turned, surprised but calm. "You still avoid the spotlight," she said softly. "Only when it tries to blind me," he replied. She smiled faintly. "You haven't changed." "Maybe I did," he said, just slower than the world expected. They sat together during the next segment, talking quietly. There was no awkwardness, just a quiet ease built from years of shared silence. They spoke about movies, friends, small things, but both avoided the question that hung between them. Finally, during a break in conversation, Sandra leaned closer and whispered, "That interview, you weren't just talking about marriage, were you?" Keanu looked down for a moment, then said, "No. I was talking about timing, and how sometimes it arrives too late, or maybe too soon." "And what about now?" she asked. He met her eyes, his voice soft but steady. "Now feels like peace trying again." Before either could say more, the host announced the next award, a Lifetime Achievement Recognition. And to everyone's surprise, it was presented to both of them together for their contribution to cinema and their impact on audiences around the world. The audience rose to their feet in applause as the two walked toward the stage side by side. It was an unexpected reunion in the spotlight, a moment the cameras caught from every angle. As they stood under the bright lights holding their awards, the crowd erupted again, but their eyes were on each other, not the audience. Keanu spoke first. "We've shared stories that became part of people's lives. And sometimes when you act beside someone who understands you without words, you realize that connection isn't written in scripts, it's written in time." His voice trembled slightly at the end, but the sincerity silenced the hall. Sandra then took the microphone, her eyes glistening under the lights. "Some people think certain bonds fade when the camera stops rolling," she said softly, "but some don't. Some stay quiet, waiting for the right moment to speak again." The room fell into a gentle hush as they looked at each other, and in that silence, something real passed between them. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't nostalgia, it was recognition. The quiet understanding that they had both walked through life's storms and still carried each other in ways words couldn't explain. After the ceremony ended, they found a quiet corner away from the noise. She looked at him, noticing the faint tiredness behind his calm smile. "You still keep everything inside," she said gently. "Maybe," he replied. "But tonight feels different." "Why?" she asked. He hesitated, then took out the small envelope from his pocket. "Because I think it's time you read something." He handed it to her, the paper soft from years of being folded. She held it, staring at it for a moment before whispering, "What is this?" "Something I wrote when words were safer on paper," he said. She looked up, her eyes filled with questions. "Do you want me to open it now?" He shook his head. "Not here. Not yet." The crowd began to move again, photographers searching for final shots. Sandra tucked the letter carefully into her small bag, her heart beating faster than she expected. She turned to him and asked, "Will I understand everything after reading it?" Keanu smiled faintly. "You might understand me." As they parted that night, flashes surrounded them, reporters shouting their names, asking questions about reunion and love, but neither responded. They just exchanged one last look, quiet, knowing, unfinished. When Sandra returned home, the world outside was still buzzing with their photos. Social media flooded with captions like they were meant to meet again, and the truth behind Keanu's words finally revealed. But she ignored all of it. She sat on her couch, the award beside her, and pulled the envelope from her bag. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, the paper was yellowed with time, the ink faded but still readable. It began with one simple line, "Dear Sandra, if words could stay calm, this is what they would say." Her eyes filled with tears before she even read further. The rest of the letter was a truth she had waited years to hear. But before she could finish, her phone buzzed, a call from an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A quiet male voice spoke, not Keanu's, but someone she didn't expect. "Miss Bullock," the voice said carefully. "This is from Keanu's team. He asked us to tell you something important." Her heart dropped as she whispered, "What happened?" The line went silent for a second before the voice continued. "He's on his way to you." The call ended abruptly, leaving her frozen. Outside, rain had begun to fall softly against the windows, the city lights blurring into silver streaks. She looked again at the unfinished letter, her pulse quickening, and whispered, "On his way." Then she stood, walked toward the window, and waited, not realizing that before dawn, a moment was coming that would test every truth they had ever believed. The road back. The rain had a strange rhythm that night, soft but persistent, like a memory trying not to fade. Sandra stood by her window, the city glowing through the drops on the glass. Her fingers traced the edge of the letter as if she could feel his presence through the ink. She had read half of it before the phone call interrupted her, and every unfinished line now weighed heavily on her mind. The words carried something more than affection. They carried restraint, the quiet kind of love that hurts because it never asks for anything in return. She looked at the clock. It was past midnight. The streets were empty except for the occasional car passing through wet asphalt. She kept thinking about the call. "He's on his way to you." Why now? After all these years of stillness, why tonight? She felt an uneasy blend of hope and fear. Hope that maybe he was ready to tell her what the letter meant, and fear that fate might once again interrupt before truth could finally breathe. Meanwhile, Keanu's car moved through the quiet roads outside the city. The rain fell harder now, turning the streetlights into soft golden smudges. He had no music on, no phone calls, no noise, just the sound of rain and the steady beating of his heart. He replayed their conversation from the award night over and over, her voice, her questions, her eyes when he gave her the letter. There had been something in her gaze that reminded him why he had written it in the first place. Because some truths are too fragile to be spoken, yet too important to die unsaid. He stopped at a red light, the reflection of his headlights flickering on the wet pavement. For a moment, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small pendant, the same one he once gave her as a wrap gift after their first movie. A small silver circle engraved with the word truth. She had returned it years ago, saying, "You'll know when to give it back." He held it tightly now, realizing that maybe the time she spoke of had finally come. Back in her apartment, Sandra sat down again and unfolded the letter completely. She took a deep breath and began to read the rest. "Dear Sandra, I once thought silence was safer than honesty, that it protected the friendship we built. But with time, I learned that silence is not peace. It's a pause that never ends. I wrote this not to change anything, but to thank you. You taught me that kindness doesn't need a stage, that love doesn't always need to be returned to be real. I never said it aloud because I was afraid the world would turn it into a story instead of a truth. So I kept it safe, here, where no one could twist it. I don't know what the future holds, but if there's ever a day when truth feels lighter, then fear, I hope we meet again and talk about everything we left unfinished." She stopped reading, her chest tight with emotion. Her tears mixed with the rain's reflection on the page. Every line was simple, but each word felt alive, as if he had written them yesterday. She smiled faintly, whispering, "Truth feels lighter than fear." Just then, the sound of a car pulling up outside drew her attention. She turned toward the window and saw headlights dim through the rain. Her heart raced. She walked to the door, unsure whether to open it or wait. The sound of footsteps echoed up the steps, slow, steady, deliberate. Then came the soft knock. She hesitated for a moment before opening the door. There he was, drenched from the rain, his hair wet, his coat darkened, his eyes calm but full of something she hadn't seen in years. He looked at her as if the years between them had dissolved in seconds. Neither spoke. The silence between them said everything. He finally smiled, a tired but genuine smile, and said softly, "I didn't want to wait anymore." She stepped aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come in." Inside, the room was warm and quiet. The only sound was the rain against the windows. He took off his coat, setting it gently on the chair, and she offered him a towel. Their movements were slow, cautious, as if afraid a wrong word might break the fragile stillness holding them together. "You read it," he said. She nodded. "Every word. And?" She looked at him carefully, her voice trembling slightly. "I think you've been holding that truth for too long." He sat down, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped. "Maybe. But I needed to make sure it was the right time." "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, looking up at her. "It feels like I've been waiting for peace, not perfection." Her eyes softened. "You've always been chasing peace." He smiled faintly. "And you've always been part of it." The air between them grew heavier, filled with years of unspoken words. She sat across from him, her gaze never leaving his face. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because," he said slowly, "I didn't want to make your life heavier. You were shining, and I didn't want my truth to dim that light." She sighed gently, tears welling again. "You never dimmed anything, Keanu. You made things calmer." "You always did." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he took out the small pendant from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "You once told me I'd know when to give this back." She looked at it, realizing what it meant. "So you think now is that time?" He nodded. "Because for the first time, I'm not afraid of what it means." She picked up the pendant, turning it in her hand. The engraved word truth caught the dim light. "You kept it all these years?" "Every day," he said softly, as a reminder that sometimes honesty waits for courage to arrive. She looked at him for a long time, and something in her expression changed. A mix of tenderness and pain. "You know, when I watched that interview, I thought you were finally ready to speak your truth to the world. But now I realize it wasn't the world you were speaking to." He smiled faintly. "No, it was to one person." A quiet tear rolled down her cheek. She wiped it quickly and said, "So what now?" Keanu leaned back, exhaling slowly. Now we stop running from the things we never finished. But before she could respond, the room was interrupted by a sudden sound, a phone vibrating sharply on the table. Keanu reached for it, glancing at the screen. His face changed slightly, tension flickering in his eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then looked at her. "It's something from the foundation I work with. They've been trying to reach me since evening." "Take it," she said gently. He answered, his voice calm. "Hello?" As he listened, Sandra watched his expression shift. Calm, turning into concern, then quiet shock. When he finally spoke again, his tone was lower. "I understand. I'll handle it." He ended the call and sat still for a few seconds. The silence heavy again. "What happened?" she asked. He looked up at her, his voice measured but soft. "There's an accident. One of the schools we've been supporting caught fire. I need to fly out tomorrow morning." Her breath caught slightly. "Is anyone hurt?" "A few people," he said. "Kids, I can't stay here long. I need to go." She stood silently, her heart sinking. Every part of her wanted to ask him to stay, but she saw in his eyes the same thing that had always defined him: compassion before comfort, duty before desire. She stepped closer, placing her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You always choose others first." He looked up, his eyes soft. "Because that's how I find peace." She nodded slowly. "Then promise me something." "What?" "That you'll come back. Not to say sorry. Not to fix anything. Just to finish this." He smiled gently. "I promise." They stood in silence once more, the rain beginning to fade outside. He reached for her hand, holding it quietly. No words, no confession, just a touch that carried years of meaning. Then, as dawn began to rise faintly in the distance, he whispered, "Truth doesn't wait forever, but it always finds its way." When he left that morning, the world outside was still wet and quiet. Sandra stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street, the pendant still warm in her palm. What neither of them knew was that the journey he was about to take, meant only for kindness, would change everything again, in a way neither could have imagined. The fire and the silence. Have you ever noticed how life tests you right after you find your peace? How the moment you begin to breathe again, something reminds you that peace isn't permanent, it's borrowed. That was what Keanu felt as his plane cut through the dark clouds that morning, heading toward a city that smelled of smoke and sorrow. The school fire had spread faster than anyone could contain. He had worked with that small foundation for years, helping rebuild schools, libraries, and shelters for children who had lost everything. Now, one of those places had been reduced to ashes overnight. As the plane landed, the air carried the scent of burnt wood and rain-soaked earth. Reporters gathered at the gates, but he walked past them quietly, carrying nothing but calm determination. He wasn't there for attention. He was there because children were waiting, scared, hurt, and lost. The drive to the site was long and silent. When he arrived, he stepped out into the gray morning light. Smoke still rose from what used to be classrooms. Firefighters moved through the wreckage, searching for anything worth saving. In one corner, a small boy sat wrapped in a blanket, clutching a half-burned notebook. Keanu knelt beside him, his voice gentle. "Is that yours?" The boy nodded silently. "It's my math book. My teacher said never give up on learning." Keanu smiled faintly, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. Then she was right. "We'll rebuild this, better than before." As he stood, one of the volunteers approached him. "We didn't expect you to come this soon." "I couldn't stay away," he said softly. "Some things you have to face in person." He spent the next few hours helping wherever he could, moving debris, speaking to families, comforting children. Every gesture was quiet but deeply sincere. Cameras tried to follow, but he avoided them. It wasn't a show. It was something sacred, an act of service born from pain and gratitude. Back in Los Angeles, Sandra followed the news. The headlines filled her phone. Keanu Reeves flies out to support victims of tragic school fire. Photos of him walking through the ruins began to circulate, his face solemn, his hands covered in dust. She stared at one picture for a long time. The way he looked at the destroyed classrooms, as if he was mourning something more than wood and stone. She whispered to herself, "He never leaves people behind." For 2 days, there was no contact between them. She waited for a message, a call, anything. But silence held her like a storm before lightning. She reread the letter again and again, memorizing every word. She wore the pendant around her neck, feeling its small weight against her skin. Every night she whispered the promise he had made. "I'll come back." But on the third night, the phone finally rang. Sandra. His voice was tired, rough around the edges. She exhaled deeply, relief washing over her. "Keanu, are you okay?" "Physically, yes," he said softly. "Emotionally, I don't know. How bad is it?" He hesitated. "It's worse than I expected. 2 teachers didn't make it. They stayed to save the kids." Her voice broke. "Oh my God," he sighed quietly. "They were brave. They did what I think love makes people do. Stay, even when leaving is safer." They stayed on the call for an hour. He told her about the children, the families, the rebuilding plans. But beneath the words, there was something heavier: exhaustion, grief, and that quiet guilt he carried whenever life reminded him how fragile everything was. "You sound like you haven't slept," she said softly. "I'll rest soon," he replied, "after I make sure everyone here is safe." Before hanging up, she said, "Keanu, don't lose yourself in other people's pain." He paused, then whispered, "It's the only place I've ever found meaning." She wanted to tell him that meaning could also come from being loved, but the words stayed behind her lips. 2 days later, he finally returned. The city felt different, colder, heavier. He went home, showered, and sat by the window in silence. The pendant's absence around his neck reminded him that truth had found its home elsewhere, with her. He picked up his phone, typed a message, then deleted it. He tried again, deleted again. He didn't know what to say. How do you speak after seeing lives shattered? How do you return to light when you've walked through smoke? Meanwhile, Sandra had been preparing dinner that evening, expecting he might call again. But the call didn't come. Instead, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a small delivery box with no sender's name. Inside was a charred wooden fragment, part of a school sign, with a short handwritten note. For every place that burns, kindness must rebuild twice as much. She knew immediately it was from him. No name, no signature, just truth. She sat down with the box on her lap, tears quietly falling. She realized that his pain was never about losing things. It was about the weight of caring too deeply. He carried everyone's sorrow like it was his own, and in doing so, forgot that he was also human. That night, she decided to go to him. The next morning, she stood at his doorstep. When he opened the door, his surprise quickly turned into something softer, gratitude, maybe even relief. "You shouldn't have come all this way," he said quietly. "Then you shouldn't have kept all that pain alone," she replied. He stepped aside, letting her in. The house was silent, lit only by soft daylight. She looked around and noticed a half-finished painting on the wall, a quiet landscape, mountains against a sunrise. She turned to him. "You've been painting again?" He nodded. "When I can't speak, I paint." "What is this one?" she asked. "A place that doesn't exist," he said. "But maybe should," she smiled faintly. "You always make things sound poetic." "I don't mean to," he said softly. "It's just the only way I understand them." They sat together for a long while, no scripts, no masks, no cameras. Just 2 people who had seen too much of life to pretend anymore. She told him about how the letter had changed the way she saw their story, not as something unfinished, but as something still unfolding. He listened quietly, then said, "I used to think truth had to be spoken to matter. Now I think it just has to be lived." She looked at him closely. "So what does living it mean for us?" He smiled gently. "It means not running from it anymore." For the first time in years, their eyes held not just friendship, but something deeper, quiet acceptance. Not the rush of new love, but the peace of 2 souls who finally understood each other. As night fell, he walked her to the door. Before leaving, she turned and said softly, "You once said timing is never perfect. Maybe that's true. But maybe some hearts don't care about timing." He looked at her with that same calm smile. Then maybe it's time we stop waiting for perfect. She stepped closer, their faces inches apart, silence trembling between them. And just as the moment seemed to bridge all the years they'd lost, a sudden flash outside caught their attention, the sound of paparazzi shutters snapping in the dark. He moved slightly, shielding her instinctively, but it was too late. Flashes filled the driveway, voices shouting questions about love, marriage, and reunion. The private truth they had guarded for so long was suddenly under the world's lens again. She whispered, "Not again." He sighed, calm, but weary. Some truths aren't meant to be hidden forever. The cameras kept flashing as they stood there, not running, not denying, just two souls caught between love and silence, between privacy and truth. And somewhere deep down, they both knew that after tonight, everything was going to change. The truth in the storm. Do you know what happens when a quiet truth escapes into a noisy world? It becomes a storm, not because it is dangerous, but because people love to twist silence into stories. That was what happened to Keanu and Sandra the next morning. The pictures were everywhere. Newspapers, social media, television, every headline carried their names again. Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock spotted together late night. Romance rekindled after emotional reunion. Truth behind Keanu's viral interview finally revealed. Reporters turned one simple evening into 1,000 theories. The internet exploded with speculation, and within hours, the truth they had guarded for decades was no longer theirs to protect. Keanu woke up to a phone buzzing endlessly, calls from his manager, messages from friends, notifications from every platform he had tried to avoid. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the screen in silence. The world had always been loud about things he wanted quiet. He didn't blame anyone. Fame came with noise, and he had learned to live with it. But this felt different. Because this time it wasn't about his movies. It was about his heart. He turned off the phone and walked to the balcony. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the smell of rain again. For a long moment, he stood still, remembering last night. Her voice, her eyes, the quiet way she said maybe some hearts don't care about timing. That line replayed in his head like a heartbeat. Behind that memory, though, came another sound, the echo of camera shutters. The reminder that truth, once seen, can't be unseen. Across the city, Sandra's morning was no quieter. Her publicist was already at her door holding a tablet full of headlines. "This is everywhere," the woman said, her tone sharp. "They're calling it the love story Hollywood never told." Sandra sat calmly on her couch, sipping coffee. "Let them talk. Are you sure you don't want to release a statement? We can say it was a friendly visit, a reunion." She looked up, her eyes steady. "And what if it wasn't just a reunion?" The publicist paused, unsure what to say. "Then you'll have to decide whether to confirm it or deny it. Because right now, everyone's waiting for your answer." Sandra placed the cup down slowly. "The world waited for answers it never earned. Maybe it's time they learned that not every truth needs their permission." For the rest of the day, she stayed off her phone. But by evening, she saw it, a video clip of Keanu being stopped by reporters outside his home. Microphones in his face, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. One reporter shouted, "Keanu, are you and Sandra Bullock finally together?" Another added, "Was your interview about her?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave that calm, unreadable smile that people had seen 1,000 times before. Then he said softly, "Some things don't need to be defined to be real," and walked away. The clip went viral within hours. Millions of people replayed it, quoting his line, calling it romantic, poetic, mysterious. Hashtags trended across platforms. Truth and timing. Keanu and Sandra forever. Everyone had their version of the story, but only the two of them knew the weight behind those words. That night, Sandra called him. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You didn't deny it." He answered calmly, "I didn't confirm it either." "You know what that means?" "Yes," he said. "It means we've lost our silence." "And how do you feel about that?" He took a deep breath, like maybe it was time. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then she said, "The press is camping outside my house. I can't even step out. Do you want me to come over?" he asked. "No," she said softly. "If they see us again, it'll only get worse." Then I'll wait, he replied, until it's quiet again. But the truth was, quiet never lasted long when love was involved. 2 days later, both were invited to appear at a charity gala that had been planned months earlier, one they had agreed to attend separately. Now, with the media storm raging, their attendance together was all anyone could talk about. Keanu considered canceling, but Sandra's message changed his mind. She wrote simply, "Maybe it's better to face the storm together than hide from it alone," and so they did. The night of the event arrived with flashing lights, crowded streets, and endless cameras. When they stepped out of their cars, not holding hands but walking side by side, the noise rose like thunder. People shouted questions, lights burned in their eyes, the chaos was almost blinding. Yet through it all, they walked calmly, neither rushing nor hiding. They didn't smile for the cameras, but they didn't run from them either. It wasn't defiance. It was quiet courage. Inside the hall, the noise faded. Soft music played, laughter filled the air. But among all the glitter and gold, there was a strange sense of gravity between them. They sat together, not as co-stars, not as rumors, but as two people who had finally stopped pretending they didn't care. At one point, a journalist politely approached their table. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Bullock," he said gently, "I know you value your privacy, but would you mind saying something about the story everyone's talking about?" Keanu looked at Sandra. She gave a small nod. He turned back to the reporter and said softly, "What you're seeing isn't a story. It's two people who respect each other deeply. Everything else you can imagine, but you might be wrong." The reporter smiled nervously, sensing both honesty and boundaries in his tone. "So it's not love?" Keanu paused, his eyes shifting toward Sandra, then back. "Love has many forms. Sometimes it's not about who you're with. It's about who stays in your life even when the world forgets." The room fell silent around them. Even those nearby pretended to be busy but were listening. Sandra smiled faintly and added, "And sometimes love isn't about possession. It's about peace, the kind of peace that never leaves, even when people do." The clip of that conversation spread faster than any headline before. People replayed it millions of times, writing in comments how their words felt different, mature, grounded, real. For once, the internet wasn't mocking. It was moved. Their honesty had disarmed the noise. Later that night, after the event, Keanu and Sandra stood outside the hall, away from the crowd. The air was cool, quiet, and full of that strange stillness that follows chaos. "You handled that well," she said softly. "So did you," he replied. "Do you think it'll calm down now?" He smiled faintly. "Storms don't end. They just move somewhere else." She looked at him, her voice quieter. "So where does that leave us?" He thought for a moment, then said, "Where we've always been. Somewhere between silence and truth." They stood there facing each other under the pale light of the street lamps. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper. "I found this while cleaning my desk. It's the second page of the letter I never gave you." She looked at him with surprise. "There was a second page?" He nodded slowly. "I didn't include it before because it was too honest." She unfolded it with careful hands, her eyes tracing the words. It said simply, "If someday I'm brave enough to speak what I feel, it won't be a confession. It'll be gratitude. Because knowing you taught me how love can exist quietly and still be real." She looked up at him, her eyes bright. "Keanu, do you realize what this means?" He nodded. "It means I finally said it." For the first time in years, she stepped closer and hugged him, not for the cameras, not for nostalgia, but for truth. The embrace was soft, long, and silent. It wasn't romantic. It was human. Two people finally free from the weight of pretending they didn't care. As they stood there, flashes went off again in the distance, but neither moved. The world could take its pictures, write its stories, twist its meanings, but for once they didn't care. Because in that quiet moment, the truth belonged to them, not the world. What they didn't know, though, was that this truth, peaceful and fragile, was about to face one final test. Something unexpected was waiting just beyond the calm, something that would once again force them to choose between silence and love. The quiet promise. Have you ever noticed that life gives its final lessons through silence, not noise? It doesn't shout its answers. It whispers them when you're finally ready to listen. That was how the last chapter of Keanu and Sandra's story began. Not with headlines, not with applause, but with stillness. Weeks had passed since the gala. The storm had faded. The world had moved on to new rumors, new stories, new distractions. But somewhere beneath all that, something real remained. Two people who had finally found peace in honesty. The noise outside had quieted, but inside, something deeper was growing. Not romantic obsession, not cinematic drama, but a kind of calm that only truth could bring. Keanu had returned to his foundation work. He spent his mornings visiting hospitals, helping children with reading programs, sitting with families who had lost their homes. His kindness wasn't performance. It was his language. The viral attention had brought more donations to the cause, but he kept his focus where it mattered. The people. He didn't talk about fame or love. He talked about rebuilding. But sometimes when the day ended, he would look out at the horizon and wonder if timing had finally made peace with truth. Sandra, too, had gone back to her quiet life. She filmed occasionally, spent time with her family, and avoided interviews about personal matters. But she carried that letter, the one that changed everything, in her bag wherever she went. Sometimes when she needed grounding, she would take it out, unfold the paper, and run her fingers over the faded words. Every line reminded her that not every love story is about endings. Some are about presence, the kind that doesn't need definition. Then one evening, an invitation arrived at her home. It was from Keanu. A handwritten note, simple and calm as always. There's a small event tomorrow. The school we rebuilt is reopening. I thought maybe you'd want to see it. No press, no cameras, just truth. She smiled at the word, truth. It had become their compass. The next morning she arrived quietly. The school stood tall and new, sunlight reflecting off its freshly painted walls. Children laughed in the courtyard, their voices bright like the sound of beginning again. Keanu was already there, dressed simply, talking with one of the teachers. When he saw her, his face softened, that same calm smile she had always known. "You came," he said. "You asked?" she replied. They walked through the building together, the halls filled with drawings and messages of gratitude from the children. One small picture caught Sandra's attention. Two stick figures holding hands under a blue sky, with the words, "Thank you for rebuilding our dreams." She smiled and said, "That's you." He shook his head gently. "That's us." Outside, the principal invited them to plant a tree near the entrance, a symbol of new beginnings. As they placed the small sapling into the soil, Keanu looked at her and said, "You know, this might be the most important role we've ever shared." She smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "No script, no cameras, just life and truth," he added softly. "And timing," she replied. They both laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that feels like forgiveness. When the ceremony ended, the children surrounded them, handing them small handmade bracelets. One little girl looked up at Sandra and said, "My mom says you two are heroes." Sandra knelt beside her and replied gently, "We're just people who care. That's all it takes." The girl smiled and ran off, leaving them standing beneath the new tree. As the sun began to lower, turning the light gold and gentle, Keanu and Sandra sat on a nearby bench. For a long time, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of understanding, of memory, of quiet gratitude. Finally, Sandra said softly, "You know, the world thinks our story is about love." He looked at her, a small smile forming. "Isn't it?" She shook her head gently. "It's about kindness, about choosing peace over pride, about showing that you can care deeply without breaking what's fragile." He nodded slowly. "Then I think that's the kind of love worth leaving behind." The wind rustled softly through the new leaves of the tree. She looked at him and said, "Do you ever wish things had been different?" He thought for a moment, his eyes distant but calm. "Sometimes. But then I realize, if things were different, maybe we wouldn't understand peace the way we do now. She smiled faintly. You always find meaning even in pain. Maybe pain is where meaning hides, he said quietly. You just have to be patient enough to uncover it. A few minutes later, one of the teachers called for a final group photo. The children, the volunteers, and the people who helped rebuild. Sandra and Keanu stood in the back row, surrounded by laughter and small hands waving at the camera. The shutter clicked, capturing not fame, not performance, but peace. When everyone began to leave, Keanu turned to her and said, "There's something I never told you about that first interview." She looked at him curiously. "The one that started all this?" He nodded. "When they asked me about marriage, I didn't plan to say anything meaningful. I almost joked it off. But then I thought about you, about how you taught me that love isn't always about possession. It's about presence. And that's why I said truth matters more than timing, because you were always my truth, even when the timing wasn't mine to control." She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes softened, her lips trembling slightly. "You know, that might be the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me." He smiled gently. Then maybe the world got one thing right after all. They walked together toward the parking lot, the sun now dipping low, painting the world in soft amber. Before parting, she turned to him one last time. "So what now?" she asked. He paused, then replied quietly, "Now we keep living. The story doesn't end because people stop watching. It ends when peace stays, even after goodbye." She nodded slowly, tears gathering but not falling. "Goodbye, Keanu." "Not goodbye," he said. "Just silence, the good kind." She smiled, turned, and walked away. He stood there, watching her go, the wind moving gently through the leaves of the tree they had planted together. And for the first time in a long time, there was no ache in his chest, no weight in his silence, only calm, the kind that feels like home. Later that night, when the stars were faint and the city lights shimmered below, Keanu sat by his window, writing in a small notebook. He wrote only one line. Some truths aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be lived quietly until they no longer need words. He closed the notebook, smiled faintly, and let the night hold him. In another part of the city, Sandra placed the letter and pendant together in a small wooden box, closed it gently, and whispered, "Truth and timing." Both found their peace. And with that, the story that began with a question about marriage ended not with an answer, but with understanding that love, in its truest form, isn't about forever. It's about peace, presence, and gratitude. And sometimes silence says everything.